Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? Is this working? Yes? Good. This is happening because some students said the speaker we would most like for Green Week, which we've now missed, would be George Monbiot. And I don't suppose anybody knows George. And I said, well, funnily enough, we've worked together for a long time, and I think he would probably take my call. And he couldn't come in Green Week because he was too busy, but here he is the week after Green Week. And this event has been slightly missold because I thought it would be more interesting not to have a conversation, but just for George to begin the conversation with a few things that are on his mind. And then I know he would like to respond to observations and questions from you. For those of you who are less familiar with George, he's a very interesting and almost unique figure, I think, in British journalism. I think he's a great example of why it is important to have fringe voices, people who say apparently extraordinary and radical things, because quite often they end up as the mainstream. And I think lots of things that George has written about and advocated and championed in the past, for which he has been roundly attacked and ridiculed and mercilessly lampooned, you watch and you think over 5 years, over 10 years, over 20 years, people no longer laugh at these ideas. They've become quite mainstream. And I've watched how George has done it. He's an amazing generalist, so he ranges across a big range of subjects. I think probably because he's been forced to defend his work so often, he has a tendency to publish all his evidence, not always in The Guardian, somewhere elsewhere. And I know, as his editor for a long time, that actually his evidence is incredibly robust. And it had to be, because George was sometimes taking on very powerful institutions and companies and ways of thinking. And so he needed to be able to defend it, and almost always.
A few mistakes along the way.
But we never had a stumping libel action or anything, did we? No. And so actually, the evidence was there. Yeah. And the other, I think George is unique in this respect. If you go to his website, he publishes his own register of interests. And he tells you exactly how much he gets paid. He tells you exactly how much tax he pays. He tells you the rental income he takes from his property. He tells you how much he pays his researchers. And everything is laid out down to the last 50p. Because he thinks that transparency in journalism is important. And I think lots of journalists think transparency is important, but I don't know anyone who takes it to the extent that George does. So he's a very interesting figure, I think, exactly the right person to be coming to LMH in not quite Green Week. And George, you talk for as long as you want, or as short as you want, and then we can open it up.
Thanks very much, Alan. Well, Alan asked me to say what was on my mind, so he's going to be pretty confused. Because, it's always pretty confused, but particularly so at the moment, because it's one of those great moments of flux for me and for hopefully many other people as well. It ought to be a great moment of flux. In fact, everything ought to be a great moment of flux at all times, but particularly now. Our thinking has been challenged, especially those of us in the second or third bloom of youth, challenged by much younger people, as it should be. And that forces reassessment. It ought to force reassessment. Unfortunately, across most of the media, it does not, and people become stuck in the groove, as we see again and again, and forces a whole rethink of our relationship to each other and to the rest of the living planet, or, as I say, so it should. So what I'm thinking about at the moment is intergenerational theft, an issue at the heart of both our environmental and economic crises, an issue brought to the fore by the brilliant youth climate strikers who were so much in evidence here in Oxford a couple of weeks ago and will be again in 8 days' time, hopefully in even greater numbers than before, who are challenging us on this crucial issue to which we have to respond. Now, in seeking to respond to it, I find myself, as always, way outside my comfort zone. I studied zoology at university, and it turned me into an idiot, or perhaps more of an idiot, because I learned an awful lot about zoology in those 3 years. And by the end of it, I felt I knew less about the rest of the world than I did when I began. I lament the extreme specialization of most of the degrees on offer today. It's crazy. We have young people on the threshold of life, the whole world at their feet, the whole world to discover. And we channel them into these amazingly narrow degrees where you learn about one subject and one subject alone. And often learn all sorts of fascinating things about that subject, but you can't contextualize it. And the times call on us all to be interdisciplinary now. We cannot grasp any aspect of what's going on Earth without understanding something of the context in which it's occurring. The more we understand, the more we see that everything is connected. As John Muir said, if you try to unhook one aspect of the world, you find that it is connected by threads to every other. And as in this globalized economy, in this globalized polity, faced with huge global environmental, economic, political, social issues, we cannot afford to remain locked within narrow disciplines if we're trying to think about the world. So I'm going to range into subjects I know absolutely nothing about tonight, including philosophy and economics, briefly, because actually I think this subject, above all others, demands overwhelmingly the input of younger people. So I'm going to try not to talk for too long in order to allow younger people and the rest of those of us who are less young people to have your say on this crucial and fascinating subject. So, intergenerational theft. Well, I would define this as the capture by current generations of natural wealth and opportunities for well-being from people who have either not yet been born or are not yet old enough to make their interests felt. And much of this, the degree to which we arrogate to ourselves the right to this capture arises from what I see as a huge, almost unexamined assumption at the heart of capitalism and indeed at the heart of most current political and economic thinking. And the assumption goes as follows: that a person is entitled to as much natural wealth as they can buy. That if you have enough money in your bank account, you can use that money to buy a big tract of land, or some minerals, or part of the atmosphere through flying your private jet around, or you're driving your Ferrari. Or you can buy as much rare fish to eat, or as much beef to eat as you want with that money. That somehow those numbers in your bank account translate into a right to a chunk of the earth, and to as much of the earth as those numbers allow you to buy. What possible just principle turns those arbitrary numbers into a right to more than your equal share of the world's natural wealth? I mean, this surely is the great and most obvious question of our times. So obviously everybody's asking it, aren't they? I haven't seen a single discussion on this subject anywhere in the media, anywhere in public discussion. It's just not there. It might be there, and forgive my ignorance if it is, in some of the fascinating academic discussions that you're having within the university, but I'm not seeing it in broader public discourse, and yet it should surely be at the heart of everything that we're discussing. It's one of those many dogs that isn't barking. Why aren't we hearing it? Now, if you push people on this, and if they have some long-standing issue in the surrounding subjects, what they might do as a first and last resort is to turn to some version of the Labour theory of property, some version of the ideas formulated by John Locke in his second treatise on government, which broadly says you acquire rights to own natural wealth. In this case, he was talking about the land, but he made it clear that it applied to other forms of natural wealth as well. You acquire rights to own natural wealth through mixing your labour with it. You mix your labour with the land, and therefore you have a right to that land. Now, straight away, even before you examine the ways in which Locke's ideas have been used, you begin to scratch your head over this formulation. And incidentally, that notion was picked up by William Blackstone and pretty well became the basis of English property law, which then became the basis of property law in many other parts of the world. It was picked up by Robert Nozick and became the basis of a whole load of other presumptions. And yet it is so flimsy, so shaky, so utterly preposterous that one wonders how it passed anyone's scrutiny at all. So let's start with Locke's initial assumption, which he formulated, as he had a good way with words, with the phrase, "all the world was once America." And what he meant by that was that all the world was once a blank slate, a terra nullis with no ownership and no rights over natural wealth. Now, he was right, but not for the reasons that he thought, because in fact, all the world pretty well had the same experience of colonization as America had. His formulation was rather convenient for a former secretary to the Lords Proprietors of Carolina, which is what John Locke was, because what was happening at the time was genocide. Other people had been mixing their labour with that land for thousands of years, roughly 14,000 years, when the Lords Proprietors and the rest turned up. But in order to establish their just principle on which they could grab the land, they first of all had to eliminate the people who were already on the land, which they did by various means, by expulsion, by chicanery, or simply by murder. Mass murder turned out to be a highly effective way of acquiring a just principle on which you can build your basis for land ownership. And it was at that point then where you say, right, now on this terra nullis, this blank slate, I can mix my labour with the land and thereby acquire rights to it. So that happens at one moment, at an arbitrary moment. There is a point at which you can disregard all previous rights, all previous mixing of labour with the land, if that was any kind of a just right of ownership, and by mixing your labour with that land at that very point, you are the one, and the one alone, who acquires the right to that land. But weirdly, it doesn't stop there, because having once acquired that right, you can then hold that right in perpetuity. You can pass that right on to your idiot children who might never have to do a stick of work in their lives because they can live off the rents of that land, which you once acquired by once mixing your labour with it. So in other words, not only is this locked in time backwards, it's locked in time forwards as well. There's that one arbitrary moment in history where you, the lucky person, can, for a year, a month, a week, a minute, mix your labour with the land, in doing so saying, this land is now mine and will be forevermore. This is patently preposterous. But it doesn't stop there, because even in Locke's formulation, your labour doesn't actually have to be your labour. In fact, in the situation he was talking about, it's precisely not your labour. What you have to do, or what you need to do, is to mix the labour of your servants or slaves with the land, and in so doing, you have a just right to acquire that land. You don't have to turn a single sod. You don't have to touch a spade. The people who are least likely to apply any labour of their own to the land are the ones who acquire the land. And what you quickly discover is that that just principle, which is the basis for land ownership, is actually based not on mixing your labour with the land, but on owning slaves. So the just principle by which people can own natural wealth is slave ownership. Doesn't sound very just to me. But then even if somehow we could magically dismiss all those objections, you're still left with the disconcerting question, why? Why does mixing your labour with the land give you a right of ownership of that land? What's the obvious connection between labour and land, between working on it and owning on it? I can see how you might have a right to own the crops because those came about entirely as a result of your labour. Or you might have the right to own a house which you build on the land because that comes about as a result of your labour. But the land itself, you didn't create it by working on it. It was there. It was there for millions of years before you were there. How come you get to own it? Own this piece of the fabric of this planet which has been kicking around for billions of years by working on it? There's no obvious connection I can see at all. It's like the constable in Flann O'Brien's novel, The Third Policeman, who goes around puncturing people's bicycle tyres because he believes that if you ride your bicycle too much, you become part bicycle and the bicycle becomes part human. You've mixed your body with the bicycle. It really is as absurd as that. But this absurdity is the basis of our sense that we have a right to ownership of natural wealth. Now, there was an important rider. Locke said, this would be just as long as there is enough and as good land for other people in common which the rest of people can share. It's fine for people to acquire as much as they want as long as everybody else has enough. Now, even at the time, it was highly debatable that there was enough for everybody else, while the lords proprietors or the tenants or settlers, whoever, who took over from them, then basically extended their land holdings as fast and as extensively as they possibly could. But today, it's evident that in no aspect of natural wealth is there enough and as good outside the domain of private property ownership as there is within it. We patently do not have enough. Billions of people on Earth do not have enough of basic commodities, let alone of an actual proprietorial share of natural wealth. It's just not there. It doesn't exist. There's not enough atmosphere for everybody at current rates of proprietorial use. The pollution that is being pumped into it. There's not enough fish. There's not enough soil. There's not enough building land, real estate. All of these commodities are scarce, which is why they are valuable commodities. So we see straight away, even with Locke's proviso at the very original formulation, this just principle cannot apply, even if all the other absurdities somehow and magically did apply. So I think we have to rethink the entire system by 6:30. Well, perhaps we don't have to rethink the entire system, because in that formulation of Locke's, enough and as good in common, I think we see part, at least, of the way forward. Is that in common bit, I think, is crucially important. When we position ourselves politically, we tend to do so along a single axis, which has state at one end and market at the other. And if you're on the left, you say, I want more state and less market. And if you're on the right, you say, I want more market and less state. And that's how we talk about things. And we have, as a result, I believe, utterly dismal political discussions. And part of the reason for that is that we completely ignore the two other equally important pillars of the economy. Number 3, the household. Crucial. Some people call it the core economy. In this wonderful book, Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner?, Catherine Marcel points out that the household is constantly neglected, and therefore the role of women, who still play the dominant role within the household, is completely neglected by economists. She points out that while Adam Smith was writing his Wealth of Nations, his long-suffering mother, Margaret Douglas, was doing all the housework around him, enabling him to write the Wealth of Nations. But her hands remained invisible. He didn't mention her role or the role of women's labour in the household at all in any of his economic treatises. Extraordinary. There's a total neglect by economists, almost all of whom for a very long time were men, of this huge third sector of the economy without which you have no other economy at all. And then there's the fourth sector of the human economy, the commons. And so neglected is this in economic discourse that every time you mention it, you have to explain it. How many people here could comfortably define the commons? That's fine, that's about average. Oh, actually more than average. Yes, a couple of halves there. Thank you. It's amazing. You know, this was once the dominant economic sector and is now so marginalized in thought and in practice that even to talk about it feels like trespassing. The commons is neither market nor state. It's not capitalism, it's not communism. It exists in a sphere of its own. It can be defined as follows. It consists of 3 principal elements: a resource, which could be a piece of land or a forest or a river or some software or a platform, an internet platform, whatever it might be, an app. A resource which is controlled by a particular community, which then creates rules and negotiations for managing that resource. Resource, community, rules and negotiations. There's 3 primary elements that define a commons, but there's a couple more bits of the definition. The resource is inalienable. It can't be sold and it can't be given away. It is acquired by any new member of that community who joins it, either through immigration into the community or through birth. It is lost by any member of the community who leaves the community, either through emigration or through death. And either the resource itself or the product of the resource is shared equally among the members of the community. Classic example is allotments. Anyone here got an allotment? Quite a few, thanks. Yeah. And you are all commoners. You're all members of a commons. What you have is a resource, which is a piece of land. You have the rules and negotiations set up by the allotment association, where you, the community, the community which is the allotment association, you set the rules and negotiations. The resource is inalienable, in principle at any rate. It can't be sold or given away. And you have an equal right to the resource itself, not to the product of the resource, because there, in justifiably mixing your labour with the land, you can take whatever crops you create that wouldn't otherwise exist back home. You don't have to share them with other people, but you get an equal plot of that land to all the other members of that community. It's a classic commons. Now, I believe that we can start to extend that principle massively into more and more sectors. We should start to think about ways in which we can start transferring natural wealth out of private hands and into common hands. We should start to look at ways in which we could legally establish the atmosphere, the oceans, the ecosystems that surround them into commons, but commons perhaps which legally entitle not just humans, but the other species with which we share them to perpetuity and inalienability. Well, as I say, this is just the beginning of a discussion, and I hope that you're going to help me to think it through a little more, because, as you've probably noticed, there's quite a lot more thinking to be done. But it seems to me that this is the scale of thinking that we need to be doing, that we have to dig up not just that unexamined assumption that I've been talking about today, but a whole series of unexamined economic and political assumptions, which, because they are unexamined, because they are invisible, allow people quietly to pocket the natural wealth and the future well-being of others, of children, of people who don't yet exist. Indeed, to write those people off through discount rates. It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? That we can use economic discounting to say, in effect, we are entitled to this stuff whose capture will deprive other people of its use. What we're effectively doing is putting discount rates on human life. And then those human beings are born, and they reach their teenage years, or they reach maturity, and they say, hang on a minute, I've got the same rights as you. And you say, yeah, you are actually a human being. Damn. How does that figure? You just realize that that whole economic theory has just gone out the window because actually you can't apply discount rates to human life. But because of all these unexamined assumptions, we effectively put their future into our pockets. And if we're going to live in a just world, if we're going to live in a world which is both spatially and temporally just, then those are the assumptions that we have to examine. Thank you.